It was spring 1979, and in the sleepy town of Assoda, Washington, children were flocking eagerly to the annual county fair. One such child was Christina Lee White. When Christina left her house that morning on her brand new white 10-speed bike that had been a birthday present, the 12-year-old was planning to spend the day with friends. Little did she, or anyone else, know that on this particular April 28th, tragedy would befall the tiny community. Assoda is, truly, a very small town, struggling to break 1,000 residents in the 2010 census. It is situated on the bank of the Snake River, nestled in low-lying mountains and thick forests. Assoda is the last town tourists will drive through before reaching Hell's Canyon, the deepest gorge on the American continent. Christina Lee White had lived in the town her entire life with her mother and stepfather, as her biological parents had divorced when she was a toddler. On that spring day, Christina, as I said, left her house via bike to join her friends at the fairground. The children had hours of unsupervised fun, but eventually, Christina began to feel ill. It's only to be expected. She was an excitable child, and the day was warm. When she called her mother at 3 p.m. from a friend's house, her mother guessed she was suffering from some form of heat sickness and told her to lie down with a wet towel on the back of her neck until she could come pick her up. She, at the time, didn't have a car available to come get Christina. Christina had struggled with overheating before, and this solution had worked last time, so when she didn't call her mother back, her mother guessed she was feeling better and had rejoined the festivities. Because of this, her mother wasn't in a particular hurry to come pick her up. Eventually, however, her mother did drive over to where Christina had placed the call, in the 500 block of 7th Street. This was sometime between 7 and 10 p.m., hours after Christina had initially placed the call. When her mother arrived, the child was nowhere to be found. Her mother searched all over for her, eventually tracking down a group of her friends and asking if they had seen her. They told her that they had last seen Christina heading home after placing the call to her mother. However, Christina had never arrived at home. Police were contacted and search teams were assembled. Her biological father suspected one of the carnies of having harmed her due to their less than pristine reputation, but all of the county fair workers were extensively interviewed and eventually cleared as suspects. This didn't, however, stop her father from following the fair as it moved through the small county until he was convinced for himself that none of them knew what had happened to Christina. Only one person was confirmed to have seen and spoken with Christina right before her disappearance. Christina, while searching for somewhere from which to call her mother, had ended up at a house in the 500 block of 7th Street, as I mentioned earlier. This was the residence of one of her school friends, Clint Carnot. Clint was, at the time, giving his dog a bath in the backyard. He didn't even know Christina had been to his house until after her disappearance. However, there was someone in the house who had seen her. Clint's stepfather, Lance Jeffrey Voss, who supposedly let Christina into the house to get a wet cloth and call her mother. Lance is the main suspect in Christina's disappearance. No trace of Christina was found for weeks. Then, about a month after her disappearance, her school papers, which she had had with her when she vanished, were located, but they were miles away from the last place she had been seen. The papers were scattered around a farm on the outskirts of town. This find yielded no further clues, except that police were almost certain Christina had been abducted. This was because she had been planning to spend a month of her summer vacation with her father and also had 2 camping trips and a baseball season approaching. Christina was a hyperactive child who had an exciting summer ahead of her. It just wouldn't make sense for her to run away. Police suspect that Christina's disappearance could be connected to the disappearances and homicides of Stephen Pearsall, stepsisters Christina Nelson and Jacqueline A. Brandy Miller, and University of Idaho student Kristen David. Pearsall, Nelson, and Miller all vanished from Lewistown, Idaho on the same night. Nelson and Miller were last seen shopping for groceries. Their bodies were later discovered in a small canyon. Pearsall was last seen leaving a night shift at the local movie theater where he was employed. He has never been discovered, but is presumed dead, and was, in fact, a suspect in the disappearances of Nelson and Miller for a short time. Kristen David's dismembered body parts were found floating in the Snake River, the same river that Christina's small town was situated upon, with no real evidence linking her to a specific killer. Police do have a person of interest for all of these crimes, but haven't officially released their name. However, people in the tight-knit community of Asotin quickly figured out who the police were suspicious of. None other than Lance Jeffrey Voss. Lance lived in the home where Christina was last seen. He was working at the Idaho Theater the night Stephen Pearsall vanished. The police didn't release his name, but they did release these crucial pieces of information, making it very easy for the public to figure out who they were talking about. While some describe Lance, who stood at over 6 feet tall and weighed more than 200 pounds, as being strong and nice, others use less flattering terms, such as eccentric, weird, and creepy. All of these disappearances and murders, Christina's case included, have been nicknamed the Lewis Clark Valley Murders and have never been solved, nor has anyone, Voss included, been charged for the crimes. Voss is an elderly man now and lives in North Carolina, far away from the scene of his alleged crimes. With so many years between him and his supposed victims, Voss will likely never be charged, nor will any real justice be brought to those he may have harmed. However, I do hope that police continue to investigate the Lewis Clark Valley murders, especially the unsolved disappearances of Stephen Pearsall and Christina White. When Christina disappeared, she was wearing blue jeans, red sneakers, and a tan and pink striped shirt, although the description of her shirt may be incorrect. She loved the outdoors and was described by her family as a bit hyperactive. She stood at 5 feet 4 inches and weighed 135 pounds. She had brown hair and hazel eyes, and had 2 noticeable white spots on her 2 front teeth. Both of her ears were pierced twice. She also goes by the nicknames Chris and Chrissy. Christina was only 12 when she vanished, and no real leads have come forward. No clues have explained to detectives what happened to the child in all the decades that separate us from her. Hopefully, one day, Christina and the other victims of the Lewis Clark Valley murderer will be properly put to rest. If you have any information on Christina, please contact the corresponding numbers in the description below. Nobody can say Diane Nguyen Robbins had an easy upbringing. The girl lived with her mother, Nguyen Nancy Robbins, a Vietnamese immigrant, Nancy's child from another relationship, Steve Robbins, and her American soldier father, Ellsworth Robbins. When Diane was only 12 years old, she came to her mother with shocking allegations against her father. She claimed Ellsworth had been raping her. Nancy immediately did the right thing. She reported her husband to the police and divorced him. Ellsworth was convicted and jailed for the crimes he had committed against his prepubescent daughter. Only a year later, tragedy would strike the family once more. Diane now lived with her mother and half-brother in Kennewick, Washington. On June 18, 1985, a then 13-year-old Diane planned to go into Seattle to meet up with some friends. She left her house and met up with 21-year-old Molly A. Purdon. They were last seen in King County in the late afternoon, still, it seemed, planning to go into Seattle. Diane would never return home, and Molly would never be seen again. What was supposed to be a simple day with friends turned into something much darker. The police assumed Diane had run away given her struggles with her trauma. However, about a month after the girls' disappearances, Molly's body was discovered. Her corpse had been dumped on the side of Index Galena Road near Milepost 8 in King County, where she had last been seen with Diane. She had been raped and killed by a blow to the head. Diane was still nowhere to be found, nor did the police get any real leads from Molly's body. This was a continuation of a horrifying local trend. In the 80s and 90s, dozens of women and girls went missing and were murdered in the Seattle area. Most, but not all, were sex workers. Police suspect an uncaught serial killer, or that a convicted criminal hasn't come forward fully about their crimes. There are many theories as to Diane's fate. One is that she was murdered by the Green River Killer, or Gary Ridgway. Diane fits his age preference, and her disappearance falls into the time frame in which he committed his crimes. While Ridgway usually went for sex workers, he did also attack runaways. Given Diane's turbulent past and her adult connections, she could have decided to run away. That might be the initial reason she vanished. However, if at any point she relied on Gary Ridgway for help, or even just encountered him on her journey, she might have met a terrible fate. However, there are two issues with this theory. The first is Molly. It makes sense that whoever killed Molly is also responsible for the disappearance of Diane. However, Molly, as I stated earlier, was killed by a blow to the head. Ridgway's method of murder was strangulation. Also, Ridgway has been incredibly forthcoming about his victims. After he realized he was going to jail, he didn't hesitate to tell police exactly who his victims had been. When the police came to him with unidentified remains, he admitted to those as well. However, he has never admitted to killing or otherwise harming Molly or Diane. Another theory is that the girls are the victims of George Waterfield Russell Jr. Purdon matched his preferred age range and was found in the area in which he murdered. He also killed one of his victims by a blow to the head, and his crimes were sexually motivated, matching up with Purdon's corpse. However, Russell took great pleasure in positioning his murder victims in incredibly demeaning and sexual positions, and nothing online suggests Molly was found in this state. Although, there is very little information about Molly online, so for all we know, the way she was found could perfectly match Russell's MO. A third theory is that Molly's lifestyle is responsible for the girls' fates. There is virtually no information about Molly online, as if she only existed in conjunction to Diane. However, online theorists have pointed out that it's incredibly strange that a 21-year-old had any interest in a 13-year-old, even for an innocent friendship. Perhaps Diane was headed down a dark path that Molly was helping her down, and whatever lifestyle Molly led got the two girls into trouble. An offset of this theory is that Molly had malicious intent for the child all along. People once again point to their strange age gap to support this idea. Perhaps Molly ran with a bad crowd, and someone convinced her to manipulate and hurt Diane, only for something to go terribly wrong. However, without further information about Molly or the life she led, this is all just conjecture. Another theory is that a serial killer terrorized the Seattle area in the 80s and 90s and was never caught. This would explain all the murders and disappearances that haven't been attributed to a convicted criminal. This serial killer could be responsible for both Molly's death and Diane's disappearance. The fifth and final theory is that transient killers are responsible for the girls' fates. Police think that many transient killers travel to Washington state with the intention of killing within state borders. This would make it incredibly difficult to figure out who was responsible for the crimes, because they could be in a totally different area of the country. No real leads ever emerged about Diane's case, and misfortune continued to plague her family. In 1989, Nancy attempted suicide. She failed, but tried again in 1991, and this time, she was successful. She left her son, Steve, behind. Steve had been born in Vietnam and immigrated to the US along with his mother. He had faced incredible discrimination in his original hometown of Los Angeles before Nancy met and married Ellsworth. Then Ellsworth, a father figure in Steve's life for years, was convicted of raping his little sister, and only a year later, his sister vanished forever, probably the victim of some terrible fate. Only a few years after her disappearance, Steve then lost his mother. Steve actually managed to turn his life around after all of this. He's an incredibly intelligent man who has dedicated his career to creating more diverse working environments and helping companies create a more welcoming employee culture. He also gives motivational speeches around the country, inspired by the incredible hardships he has had to overcome. He is married and has several children, and he is very devoted to his family. Steve is incredibly inspiring and is a good example of one element of these cold cases that don't get explored enough. We should focus on victims like Diane, yes, but there are also family members, friends, or even simple community members who are deeply affected by the loss of their loved ones and children. Steve is one such person who, despite seemingly losing everything, created a successful life, making the world a better place. Still, he has no closure for his sister's case, and hope in solving it is dwindling. Both Molly and Diane are featured on the Washington State cold case playing cards, which are then passed around in prisons so if inmates recognize the victims, they can help solve the cold cases. Unfortunately, no inmates have, at the time of this recording, come forward with any information. Diane is Vietnamese Caucasian and has brown hair and brown eyes. She has a 1-inch long scar on her forehead. Her case is classified as a non-family abduction. Please, if you have any information on where Diane is or who killed Molly, contact the corresponding numbers in the description below. Please help bring these missing children home.